Leave her behind. We do not need her for this part of the mission." The words hung in the air like a challenge the moment Commander Robert Hayes spoke them. Inside the briefing room of a forward operating base in eastern Syria, every operator around the table went silent. Satellite images covered the screen on the wall. Routes, checkpoints, and possible observation points filled the map. The mission was important. A local extremist network had been moving supplies through a remote corridor, and the team had been assigned to gather intelligence before a larger operation could begin. Sarah Mitchell sat near the end of the table, her expression calm even as several eyes turned toward her. She had heard comments like this before. She was the newest member of the unit, and despite years of preparation, many people still saw her as someone who had something to prove. Commander Hayes pointed to the map. "The primary reconnaissance team moves tonight. Anderson, Miller, Grant, you are with me." Sarah waited. Her name never came. Hayes folded his arms. "Mitchell stays at the support position." Nobody argued. Nobody except Jake Anderson. "Sir, she has been studying this region for weeks," he said carefully. Hayes barely looked at him. "That is my decision." Jake leaned back in his chair, but did not look convinced. Sarah remained silent. She had learned long ago that arguing rarely changed minds. Results did. The briefing continued for another 20 minutes. Distances were discussed. Supply schedules were reviewed. Extraction windows were confirmed. Yet Sarah noticed something else. The route chosen by Hayes crossed an area that had become unusually quiet during the previous 48 hours. Too quiet. Local traffic reports had changed. Several civilian vehicles that normally appeared on surveillance footage had vanished. It bothered her. After the meeting ended, she approached the commander with a tablet in hand. "Sir, may I show you something?" Hayes sighed. "Make it quick." Sarah displayed several images side by side. "The patterns here do not match what we saw last week." Something changed. Hayes glanced at the screen for only a few seconds. "Or maybe nothing changed." "I do not think so, sir. You are overanalyzing." He handed the tablet back and walked away. Sarah watched him leave. The dismissal felt familiar, but the concern remained. Later that evening, as the desert air cooled and the sun disappeared beyond the horizon, Jake found her near the communications tent. "You still thinking about that route?" he asked. Sarah nodded. "Something is wrong." Jake studied her face. "You sound certain." "I am." He looked toward the vehicles being prepared for departure. "Then I hope you are wrong." Sarah wished she could agree. A few hours later, the convoy rolled into the darkness. Dust trailed behind the vehicles as they disappeared beyond the perimeter. Sarah stood watching until the final lights vanished. Around midnight, she returned to the operations center. Everything seemed normal until an alert flashed across a monitoring screen. One signal had suddenly gone offline. Then another. An operator at the communications desk frowned and adjusted his headset. The room grew quiet. Sarah stepped closer. "What happened?" she asked. The technician looked up slowly. "We just lost contact with part of the team." Seconds later, another message appeared. It was incomplete, broken by interference. But one detail was unmistakable. Jake Anderson's identifier had stopped moving. Sarah stared at the screen as the blinking identifier remained frozen in place. Around her, the operations center became increasingly tense. Technicians adjusted frequencies, checked backup systems, and attempted to re-establish communication with the reconnaissance team. Every few seconds, another operator requested an update, but the answers remained the same. No contact, no confirmation, no explanation. Commander Hayes entered the room moments later, his expression controlled but serious. He moved directly toward the communication station. "Report." The lead technician pointed to the display. "We lost several signals approximately 12 minutes ago. We are receiving fragmented transmissions, but nothing complete." Hayes studied the map. The last known position of the team appeared exactly where Sarah had warned him earlier. The commander remained silent. Sarah stepped forward. "Sir, that location is inside the area I mentioned during the briefing." Hayes glanced at her before returning his attention to the monitor. "We do not know what happened yet." Sarah understood that, but deep down she also knew something else. The unusual traffic patterns, the missing civilian vehicles, the sudden silence across multiple observation points. None of it had felt normal. She had spent weeks studying the region, learning how local movement patterns changed before major events. The signs had been there. Nobody had wanted to see them. Another burst of static interrupted the room. A technician quickly increased the volume. Several broken words emerged through the interference. Most were impossible to understand. Then one phrase became clear enough to recognize. Separated from. The transmission ended immediately afterward. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. Jake had been part of the forward element. If the team had become separated, he could be anywhere within miles of difficult terrain. Hayes immediately ordered additional surveillance assets into the area. Drones already operating nearby were redirected toward the last known coordinates. The first images began arriving 20 minutes later. Sarah watched carefully as dusty roads, abandoned structures, and empty fields appeared on the screens. Nothing looked unusual at first. Then she noticed something. Stop. One of the drone operators paused the footage. Sarah pointed toward a narrow road near a cluster of abandoned buildings. Several tire tracks crossed the area. They were recent. Much more recent than the surrounding marks. The operator zoomed in. Hayes stepped closer. You think those matter? Sarah nodded. They do. Hayes crossed his arms. Why? Sarah zoomed the image further. Because they appeared after the last satellite passed 6 hours ago. And they are moving toward the same sector where communication stopped. The room fell quiet. Nobody challenged her analysis. Hayes looked at the data for several seconds. Continue monitoring. It was not an admission that she was right, but it was the first time all night that he had not immediately dismissed her observation. Hours passed. The desert sky slowly approached dawn. Fatigue began affecting everyone in the operations center. Yet Sarah remained focused. She reviewed every available image, every intercepted transmission, and every movement report. The more information she gathered, the more concerned she became. A pattern was forming. The reconnaissance route had not been randomly disrupted. Someone had anticipated movement through the area. Shortly before sunrise, a drone captured a new image. A small heat signature appeared near a dry riverbed several miles from the original route. The signal was weak and intermittent. Most people in the room barely noticed it. Sarah did. She leaned toward the display. Zoom in. The image sharpened slightly. The signature disappeared, then returned again. The technician frowned. Could be anything. Sarah shook her head. No. Look at the timing. The signal appeared at consistent intervals. Not random. Deliberate. Almost like someone was trying to remain hidden while still creating a detectable pattern. Hayes stared at the screen. For the first time all night, uncertainty crossed his face. Sarah looked at the coordinates and immediately recognized something important. The location matched a route she had studied during her preparation. A route that bypassed the most dangerous sections of the region. If someone from the team had become isolated and needed to move carefully, it was exactly where they would go. Hayes finally turned toward her. You know this area better than anyone here, do not you? Sarah met his eyes. Yes, sir. The commander looked back at the map. The room waited for his decision. Several long seconds passed before he spoke again. Then tell me where that signal is going. Sarah stepped closer to the digital map and studied the coordinates once more. Every pair of eyes in the operations center followed her. Only a few hours earlier, most people in the room had barely acknowledged her warnings. Now the situation had changed. The missing communications, the unexplained movement patterns, and the isolated heat signature had forced everyone to reconsider assumptions. Sarah traced a route across the screen with her finger. If that signal belongs to one of our operators, there is only one logical destination. Commander Hayes remained silent. Sarah continued. There is an abandoned water distribution station about 4 miles east of that location. The terrain provides concealment, and the structure still has partial underground access. Anyone trying to avoid detection would naturally move there. One of the intelligence analysts nodded. That actually matches older infrastructure maps. Hayes looked at the analyst and then back at Sarah. How confident are you? Sarah answered immediately. Very confident. The commander studied her expression. There was no hesitation in her voice. No uncertainty. Just quiet conviction. For the first time since she had joined the unit, Hayes appeared willing to listen. A drone was redirected toward the area Sarah had identified. The flight would take time. While everyone waited, technicians continued attempting to establish communication with the missing operators. Most transmissions remained fragmented. Then another signal briefly appeared. The room instantly became alert. A technician isolated the frequency. Static filled the speakers. Several broken words emerged. Nobody could understand most of the message. Then one name came through clearly. Anderson. Sarah immediately turned toward the screen. The transmission lasted only 2 seconds before disappearing again. It was not much, but it was enough. Jake was alive. Relief passed through her, but it lasted only a moment. Being alive did not mean being safe. Hayes ordered every available resource to focus on locating the source of the transmission. Minutes later, the drone reached the sector Sarah had identified. Grainy images appeared on the main display. The old water station slowly came into view. Dust-covered walls surrounded the structure. Parts of the roof had collapsed years earlier. At first glance, it appeared abandoned. Then Sarah noticed something unusual. Zoom in on the western entrance. The operator enlarged the image. Fresh tracks crossed the ground leading toward the building. Hayes narrowed his eyes. Recent. Sarah nodded. Within hours. Another analyst reviewed the footage. She is right. Nobody in the room argued. The evidence was becoming impossible to ignore. Hayes leaned forward. Can we confirm whether Anderson is there? The drone operator adjusted several settings and switched to thermal imaging. Everyone watched the screen. Several moments passed. Then faint heat signatures appeared inside the structure. The room immediately grew quiet. Nobody spoke. Sarah counted carefully. 1, 2, 3, 4. More appeared deeper within the building. The exact number remained unclear. Hayes looked concerned. Can we identify which one belongs to Anderson? Negative, the operator replied. Resolution is limited. Sarah continued studying the image. Something about it felt wrong. She examined the placement of the heat signatures and noticed a pattern. Most of them remained stationary. One moved slowly along the outer edge of the structure before stopping. Then it moved again, not randomly, deliberately. Sarah felt a sudden realization. That one. She pointed to the screen. Hayes looked at her. Why that one? Because it is checking sight lines. The commander frowned. Sarah explained. The others are staying inside protected areas. That signature is moving between observation points. Someone is monitoring approaches. Hayes considered her words. The more he looked, the more sense it made. Sarah was seeing details everyone else had missed. Again, the realization seemed to bother him. Hours earlier, he had dismissed her concerns. Now her analysis was guiding the entire operation. One of the communications technicians suddenly raised his hand. Sir, incoming transmission. The room froze. A weak signal appeared across the monitor. Static crackled through the speakers. Then a familiar voice emerged. Exhausted, distorted, but recognizable. It was Jake. The message contained only a few words before interference overwhelmed the signal. Yet those few words changed everything. Sarah listened carefully. The coordinates he mentioned matched the water station exactly. Hayes slowly turned toward her. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he looked back at the map and made a decision that surprised everyone in the room. Prepare a recovery plan. Sarah expected relief. Instead, she felt concern. Because she already knew something Hayes did not. If Jake had reached the water station by choice, he was not simply hiding. He was waiting for something. And whatever he was waiting for was about to happen. The operations center immediately shifted into motion after Commander Hayes ordered a recovery plan. Analysts reviewed maps, technicians monitored drone feeds, and mission coordinators began calculating possible insertion routes. Yet despite the activity, a sense of uncertainty filled the room. Everyone understood that locating Jake Anderson was only the first challenge. Reaching him safely was something else entirely. Sarah remained focused on the images coming from the drone. The water station continued to occupy most of her attention. The more she studied the area, the more convinced she became that Jake had chosen the location for a reason. He was experienced, disciplined, and careful. If he had transmitted those coordinates, he wanted the team to understand something. Hayes approached her station. What are you seeing? Sarah enlarged the map and pointed to several dry channels surrounding the structure. These old irrigation routes connect to multiple villages. Hayes nodded. And someone familiar with the region would know they create hidden movement corridors. The commander looked back at the screen. You think Jake found one of those routes? I think he followed one. More importantly, I think he expects someone else to follow it too. Hayes frowned. The implication was obvious. Jake was not simply waiting to be rescued. He was observing something important. An intelligence officer joined the discussion. If that is true, rushing a recovery team into the area could compromise whatever information he has. Sarah nodded. Exactly. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Hayes made a decision. We wait until we know more. Sarah felt immediate concern. Time was becoming a factor. Every hour increased uncertainty. Yet she also understood the commander's reasoning. Acting too quickly could create even greater problems. The drone continued circling overhead. As the morning progressed, additional imagery arrived. Sarah carefully compared the latest footage against older surveillance records. Small differences began appearing. A vehicle track here. A disturbed patch of ground there. Tiny details most people would overlook. Together, they formed a pattern. She requested access to archived images from the previous 2 weeks. A technician pulled them up. Sarah spent nearly 30 minutes reviewing them one by one. Then she finally found what she was looking for. There. Several analysts gathered around her monitor. Sarah highlighted a section of terrain roughly 2 miles from the water station. The older images showed almost no activity. The newer images revealed repeated movement through the same area. Hayes crossed his arms. What does that tell us? Sarah zoomed out. The route is becoming more active. Could be civilian traffic. Sarah shook her head. Not likely. The timing is too consistent. One analyst compared the timestamps and immediately agreed. The movement occurred at predictable intervals. Not random. Organized. Hayes looked increasingly troubled. Sarah understood why. The situation was becoming larger than a missing operator. Whatever had disrupted the mission appeared connected to a broader network operating across the region. Suddenly, another transmission alert sounded through the room. Everyone turned toward the communications desk. The signal was weak but stronger than before. Technicians worked quickly to isolate the source. A voice emerged through the static. It was Jake again. This time the message lasted longer. Not long enough to provide a full explanation, but long enough to reveal one critical detail. Sarah listened carefully. Jake mentioned observing repeated movement toward a location farther east. Then the transmission ended. The room fell silent. Hayes immediately requested an updated map. Sarah was already studying it. Her eyes moved across the terrain until they stopped at a cluster of structures nearly 10 miles away. Her expression changed. Hayes noticed immediately. What is it? Sarah looked up. I know that area. How? I studied it before deployment. Hayes waited. Sarah pointed to the map. There is an old agricultural compound there. Most reports classify it as abandoned. And Sarah took a slow breath. It is not abandoned. The room became quiet. Hayes stared at her. How can you be sure? Sarah met his eyes. Because 6 months ago I saw photographs from a local source. The buildings were being used. Nobody believed the report. It was dismissed. Hayes looked back at the map. The realization was difficult to ignore. Another warning. Another detail Sarah had identified long before anyone else. The commander remained silent for several moments before speaking. Then we need confirmation. Sarah nodded slowly. But deep down she already knew confirmation was not the real problem. The real problem was that Jake appeared to be moving toward that location. And if her memory was correct, reaching him would soon require a decision that Hayes was not going to like. Commander Hayes spent the next hour reviewing every available source of information connected to the agricultural compound. The results were frustrating. Most reports described the location as abandoned. Several records had not been updated in years. Yet the more current surveillance Sarah examined, the more convinced she became that the reports were wrong. Activity existed there. Not constant activity, but enough to prove the site still mattered to someone. The operations center remained busy as analysts compared satellite imagery with drone footage. Sarah sat quietly near the main display, reviewing terrain data she had collected long before the mission began. She remembered the first time she had studied the region. While most analysts focused on major roads and population centers, she had concentrated on forgotten infrastructure. Old irrigation networks, dry riverbeds, agricultural routes. The places people ignored often became the most useful paths for anyone trying to move without attracting attention. As she compared maps, a realization slowly formed. Jake had not accidentally ended up near the water station. His movements suggested a deliberate direction. He had been heading toward the compound. Hayes eventually walked over carrying a folder filled with printed reports. I still do not like it, he admitted. Sarah looked up. The compound. The idea that Anderson would move toward it. Sarah studied the map again. Then he probably did not choose it because it was safe. Hayes remained silent. He understood exactly what she meant. If Jake believed something important was happening there, he would continue observing even while isolated from the rest of the team. One of the intelligence officers approached with updated drone imagery. You should see this. The new images appeared on the large screen. Several structures near the compound showed signs of recent maintenance. Roof sections had been repaired. Vehicle tracks connected multiple buildings. Storage areas appeared cleaner than expected for an abandoned site. Hayes stared at the screen. That is not normal. No, sir, Sarah replied. It is not. Another analyst pointed toward a narrow route leading into the compound from the south. This path was not visible in older imagery. Sarah immediately recognized it. The route connected directly to a dry canal system extending for miles. Someone familiar with local geography could travel significant distances while remaining difficult to detect from the main roads. Hayes folded his arms. You knew about this route. Sarah nodded. That is why I was concerned during the original briefing. Nobody challenged her statement. At this point, too many of her observations had proven correct. The room fell quiet as everyone absorbed the growing significance of the situation. Then another transmission alert appeared. Every head turned toward the communications station. The signal quality was poor, but stronger than before. Jake's voice emerged through the static. He sounded tired, yet focused. His message remained fragmented, but several key words became clear. Observation, movement, compound. Then one final phrase came through before the transmission disappeared. Do not send. The rest vanished into interference. Hayes immediately looked toward the technicians. Can we recover the rest? They tried repeatedly, but the missing portion could not be reconstructed. Sarah replayed the message in her mind. Do not send. It could mean many things. Do not send reinforcements. Do not send vehicles. Do not send aircraft. The uncertainty bothered her. Yet one detail stood out. Jake had specifically mentioned observation before the message ended. He wanted them to know he was still gathering information. Hayes moved toward the command table. We cannot ignore this any longer. Several officers gathered around him. Sarah remained nearby. The discussion quickly turned toward possible recovery options. Most proposals involved larger teams and direct approaches. Sarah listened carefully before finally speaking. Those routes will be expected. The room became quiet. Hayes looked at her. What would you do? It was the first time he had ever asked that question. Sarah walked to the map and pointed toward a series of terrain features stretching across the eastern sector. There is another way. Several officers leaned forward. The route she identified appeared longer and more difficult than the others. It wound through neglected farmland, crossed sections of dry terrain, and avoided the most obvious access points. One officer shook his head. That would take much longer. Yes, Sarah replied. But it would also avoid every location currently under observation. Hayes studied the route for a long moment. Nobody spoke. Finally, he looked directly at her. How familiar are you with that path? Sarah answered without hesitation. Familiar enough to follow it in the dark. The commander stared at her for several seconds. Then he glanced around the room. Every alternative seemed increasingly risky. Every new piece of evidence pointed toward the same conclusion. Sarah understood the terrain better than anyone else present. Hayes slowly exhaled. The decision clearly weighed on him. When he finally spoke, his words surprised everyone. Prepare a small recovery element. Several officers nodded. Then he looked directly at Sarah. And you are going with them. The atmosphere inside the operations center changed the moment Commander Hayes assigned Sarah to the recovery element. Nobody openly questioned the decision, but she could feel the surprise in the room. Only a day earlier, she had been excluded from the most important phase of the mission. Now the commander was trusting her knowledge of the terrain to guide the team toward a missing operator. Sarah wasted no time. Within minutes, she was reviewing route plans, weather projections, satellite imagery, and supply requirements. The proposed path stretched across nearly 12 miles of difficult terrain. It was not the fastest route. It was the least predictable. That was precisely why she had chosen it. As preparations continued, Hayes approached her carrying a tablet. Walk me through it again. Sarah enlarged the map and pointed toward a series of dry canal systems extending eastward from the base of a rocky ridge. Most people focus on the roads. That is the mistake. Hayes listened carefully. Go on. These channels were built decades ago. Most are abandoned now. From above, they look insignificant. On the ground, they provide cover and natural navigation points. Hayes studied the screen. You are certain this is the best approach? Sarah nodded. If Jake is still observing movement near the compound, He expects anyone coming for him to avoid the obvious routes. The commander remained silent for a moment before asking a different question. How did you learn all this? Sarah looked at the map. Before deployment, I spent months studying local infrastructure reports, agricultural surveys, and historical satellite imagery. Hayes raised an eyebrow. Months? Yes, sir. The commander slowly nodded. For perhaps the first time, he was beginning to understand how much preparation she brought to the mission. Several hours later, the recovery team departed. The desert landscape stretched endlessly beneath a bright afternoon sky. Sarah moved at the front of the small element, carefully following landmarks that barely appeared on modern maps. The route took them through neglected farmland, dry streambeds, and narrow passages between low ridges. Progress was steady but cautious. Every few miles the team stopped briefly while Sarah verified their position against terrain features she had memorized long before arriving in the region. One of the operators finally looked at her and asked, "You have actually been through this route before?" Sarah shook her head. "No." The operator looked confused. "Then how do you know where we are?" Sarah smiled slightly. "Because the terrain matches the reports." The operator exchanged a glance with another teammate. Neither seemed entirely convinced. Yet every time Sarah predicted a turn, a landmark, or a hidden path, the terrain unfolded exactly as she described. By late afternoon, even the most skeptical members of the team had stopped questioning her directions. As the sun began lowering toward the horizon, the recovery element reached a rocky overlook several miles from the compound. Sarah immediately dropped to one knee and studied the area ahead. Through binoculars, she observed the distant structures. Vehicle movement appeared limited. From a distance, the location still looked abandoned. Yet subtle details told a different story. Tracks maintenance, activity patterns. Everything matched her earlier assessment. One operator quietly spoke. "Looks empty." Sarah never lowered the binoculars. "It only looks empty." The team settled into a concealed observation position. Their next step depended entirely on locating Jake. Minutes passed. Then an unexpected signal appeared on one of the portable receivers. Weak, intermittent, familiar. Sarah immediately recognized the frequency. Jake. The operator monitoring communications adjusted the equipment. A broken transmission emerged through the static. Several words were impossible to understand. Then a clear phrase came through. "North side, after sunset." The signal vanished again. Every member of the recovery element became alert. Sarah stared toward the compound. Jake had left them a clue. More importantly, he had left it at exactly the moment they arrived, which meant he somehow knew they were close. As darkness slowly settled across the desert, Sarah focused on the northern edge of the compound. Then she noticed something moving near a line of abandoned storage buildings. The shape appeared briefly before disappearing again. One of the operators whispered, "Did you see that?" Sarah nodded. Her heart immediately began racing. Because after days of uncertainty, she was almost certain she had finally found Jake. The problem was that he was not alone. Sarah remained perfectly still as she watched the movement near the abandoned storage buildings. The fading sunlight made details difficult to distinguish, but her instincts immediately told her that the figure she had spotted was Jake. The timing matched. The location matched. Most importantly, the brief transmission they had received minutes earlier pointed directly to the northern side of the compound. One of the operators beside her adjusted his binoculars. "Can you confirm it?" Sarah continued watching. The figure appeared again for only a second before disappearing behind a wall. "Not yet," she replied quietly. The recovery element maintained its concealed position while darkness slowly spread across the desert. Sarah studied every structure, every access route, and every shadow surrounding the compound. She was not looking only for Jake. She was looking for patterns. During the previous week, she had learned that the smallest details often revealed the truth. After several minutes, she finally noticed something unusual. Activity around the compound followed a rhythm. Certain areas remained active while others stayed untouched. The northern edge appeared almost ignored. That was exactly why Jake had chosen it. He had identified the weakest point. One of the operators checked his watch. "What is the plan?" Sarah considered the question carefully. The easiest choice would have been to move immediately. Instead, she continued observing. Patience had already proven valuable throughout the mission. A rushed decision could ruin everything. Then the portable receiver crackled again. Everyone froze. A weak transmission emerged through the static. This time the voice was unmistakable. Jake. The message lasted only a few seconds. Wait for movement. Follow the trucks. Then silence returned. Sarah immediately focused on the roads leading toward the compound. He is telling us something, one operator said. Sarah nodded. Yes. Approximately 20 minutes later, distant headlights appeared on the horizon. Several vehicles slowly approached the compound from the southeast. The recovery element watched carefully as the vehicles entered through a secondary access point and disappeared between the buildings. Sarah smiled slightly. That is it. The others looked at her. What? Jake wanted us to see where they go. She studied the layout once more. The vehicle movement revealed routes that had previously been hidden from view. More importantly, it confirmed something she had suspected since the beginning. The compound was functioning as a logistics site connecting multiple locations across the region. Jake had not remained nearby because he was trapped. He had stayed because he was collecting information. One operator shook his head in disbelief. He stayed out here alone just to confirm that? Sarah answered quietly. That sounds like Jake. As the night deepened, Sarah finalized a route toward the northern side of the compound. The path avoided open areas and followed terrain features she had identified days earlier. The recovery team moved carefully through the darkness. Every landmark appeared exactly where Sarah predicted. Every turn matched her mental map. The operators following her no longer questioned her directions. At one point, they reached a narrow depression hidden between two low ridges. One teammate looked around and quietly said, I never would have found this route. Sarah kept moving. That is why we are using it. Nearly an hour later, they reached a position overlooking the northern structures. The distance separating them from the compound had shrunk dramatically. Through binoculars, Sarah scanned the area once more. Then she saw him. Jake Anderson stepped briefly into view near a storage building before disappearing again. Relief washed over her. After days of uncertainty, he was alive. She quickly signaled the others. One operator looked through the binoculars and grinned. That is him. For the first time since the mission began, confidence spread through the team. They had found their missing operator. Yet Sarah's attention remained fixed on the compound. Something still felt unfinished. Jake was alive. The recovery route was ready. Everything should have been simple from this point forward. But then Jake suddenly appeared again. Instead of moving toward their position, he turned and looked deeper into the compound. Moments later, he disappeared behind another building. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. He was not preparing to leave. He was still watching something. And whatever had captured his attention was important enough that he was willing to delay his own rescue to learn more. Sarah kept her binoculars trained on the area where Jake had disappeared. The recovery team remained concealed among the rocky terrain overlooking the northern side of the compound. Minutes passed without movement. The operators beside her exchanged uncertain glances. They had located Jake. The route out had been planned. Yet instead of moving toward safety, he had chosen to remain focused on something deeper inside the compound. Sarah understood why. Jake was not reckless. If he stayed, there was a reason. The question was whether that reason justified the risk. Another 15 minutes passed before a faint signal reached the portable receiver. The transmission was weak but clear enough to identify the source. Jake. Everyone immediately focused on the device. His voice emerged through static. One more movement. Important. Wait. Then the signal vanished again. Sarah slowly lowered the receiver. One operator shook his head. He wants us to stay here? Sarah nodded. That is exactly what he wants. The team settled back into observation positions. Nobody liked waiting, but everyone trusted Jake's judgment. The desert night remained quiet as distant lights flickered around the compound. Sarah continued watching vehicle activity. Gradually, a pattern emerged. Certain buildings received regular visits while others remained untouched. One structure near the center of the compound seemed particularly important. Vehicles arrived there. Personnel entered. Then they departed again. Sarah carefully marked each movement on a digital map. The longer she watched, the clearer the pattern became. Jake had been right to stay. Whatever operation was taking place here extended far beyond a simple supply route. Nearly an hour later, movement increased. Several vehicles arrived within a short period of time. Sarah immediately noticed the difference. Something changed. One of the operators looked through his optics. I see it. More lights appeared across the compound. Activity that had been spread out suddenly concentrated around the central building. Sarah quietly transmitted an update to Commander Hayes at the forward operating base. Within minutes, Hayes responded through a secure channel. "What are you seeing?" Sarah described everything. The vehicles, the timing, the concentration of movement. Hayes listened carefully. Unlike earlier in the mission, he did not interrupt. When she finished, several seconds passed before he replied. "Continue observation." Sarah almost smiled. A few days earlier, he would have dismissed her assessment immediately. Now he was relying on it. As midnight approached, Jake finally appeared again. This time he emerged from behind a row of storage buildings and moved toward the northern perimeter. Sarah instantly recognized the signal. He was coming. The recovery team prepared quietly. Minutes later, a shadow emerged from the darkness near their position. Jake Anderson stepped into view. Relief spread through the entire team. One operator reached out and shook his hand. Another smiled. "Good to see you." Jake returned the greeting, but immediately turned toward Sarah. "You found the route." Sarah nodded. "You left enough clues." A tired grin crossed Jake's face. "I hoped you would understand them." The recovery team expected an immediate departure. Instead, Jake knelt beside Sarah and opened a small notebook. Several pages contained observations, timestamps, vehicle counts, and route information collected during the previous days. Sarah quickly reviewed the notes. Her eyes widened. The information was far more extensive than anyone expected. Jake had documented nearly everything happening around the compound. "You stayed for all this?" she asked. Jake nodded. "I knew somebody needed to see the full picture." Sarah understood immediately. The intelligence gathered here could influence future operations throughout the region. The risk had produced valuable information. A secure communication link connected them with Hayes once more. Jake delivered a concise report. When he finished, silence followed. Then Hayes asked a surprising question. "Who identified the compound?" Jake looked directly at Sarah. "She did." Another pause followed. "Who found the approach route?" Hayes asked. Jake answered without hesitation. "Sarah." The channel remained silent for several seconds. Then Hayes spoke again. His voice sounded different than before. More thoughtful. More reflective. "Bring everyone home." The transmission ended. As preparations for departure began, Jake sat beside Sarah for a moment. "You know," he said quietly, "when I first joined the team, people underestimated me too." Sarah looked at him. Jake smiled. "Not this much, though." She laughed softly. For the first time in days, some of the tension disappeared. Yet neither of them realized that the biggest surprise was still waiting back at the base, because while they were out in the desert, Commander Hayes had started reviewing records that should have changed his opinion of Sarah long before this mission ever began. The journey back to the forward operating base felt very different from the tense days that had come before it. Jake was no longer missing. The intelligence gathered near the compound had been secured. Most importantly, every member of the recovery element was returning safely. Yet Sarah sensed that something had changed long before they reached the base. The operators who had once questioned her directions now followed her observations without hesitation. Conversations that previously excluded her now naturally included her. Nobody announced the change. It simply happened. Experience had a way of replacing assumptions. As the convoy approached the perimeter of the base, dawn began spreading across the horizon. The first sunlight illuminated rows of vehicles, communications equipment, and temporary structures. Personnel moved through the compound, beginning another day of operations. Sarah expected a routine debriefing followed by several hours of paperwork and analysis. Instead, she noticed something unusual almost immediately. Commander Hayes was already waiting outside the operations building. Jake saw him too. "That is not normal," he said quietly. Sarah nodded. Hayes was not a man known for ceremonial welcomes. He preferred reports, results, and efficiency. Yet there he stood watching the convoy arrive. The recovery team exited their vehicles and entered the operations center for the official debriefing. Intelligence specialists quickly began reviewing Jake's notes and comparing them against surveillance records. The results impressed everyone. Patterns that previously seemed unrelated suddenly connected together. Routes, schedules, and locations formed a much clearer picture. Several analysts openly praised the quality of the information. Jake accepted the compliments politely, but repeatedly directed attention toward Sarah. "We would never have reached the observation point without her route. We would never have identified the compound without her analysis." We would never have found me without her understanding of the terrain. Each statement added to a growing silence around the room. People were beginning to realize how often Sarah had been correct throughout the entire mission. Hours later, the formal debriefing concluded. Most personnel expected to return to their normal duties. Instead, a message arrived requesting the presence of the entire unit. The gathering took place inside a large briefing room. Operators filled the seats while officers stood along the walls. Sarah quietly took a place near the back. She preferred it there. Attention had never been her goal. Results had always mattered more. Commander Hayes stepped to the front of the room, carrying a folder. The room gradually became silent. He looked across the assembled personnel before speaking. There are moments in leadership when mistakes become impossible to ignore. Several people exchanged curious glances. Hayes rarely spoke in such personal terms. He opened the folder and continued. Over the past 48 hours, I reviewed mission reports, training records, evaluations, and operational history connected to one member of this unit. Sarah immediately suspected where this was going. Hayes looked directly at her. Sarah Mitchell. Every eye in the room turned toward her. The commander continued. Before this deployment, Sarah completed specialized regional studies, advanced intelligence preparation, language training, and multiple operational assignments related to terrain analysis. The room remained completely silent. Hayes closed the folder. Most of that information was available to me before this mission. He paused briefly. I failed to give it the attention it deserved. Nobody expected those words. A commander openly admitting a mistake was uncommon. Hayes took a slow breath. During this operation, Sarah identified risks others missed. She recognized patterns others ignored. She provided the route that allowed the recovery team to succeed. Most importantly, she demonstrated the professionalism and judgment every operator should strive to achieve. Sarah felt uncomfortable being the center of attention, but she also understood the significance of the moment. This was not about praise. It was about acknowledgement. Hayes looked around the room. Respect should be earned through performance. She earned it. Jake smiled from the front row. Several operators nodded in agreement. Then something unexpected happened. Hayes stepped forward and extended his hand. Sarah stood and walked toward him. The commander shook her hand firmly. No dramatic speech followed. None was necessary. The gesture itself carried more meaning than words. As applause spread through the room, Sarah looked around at the faces of her teammates. Days earlier, many had doubted her. Now they saw her differently. Not because she had demanded recognition, not because she had argued for it, but because she had quietly done the work when it mattered most. Later that evening, as the desert sun disappeared beyond the horizon, Sarah and Jake stood outside the operations building looking across the base. Jake smiled. You know, I had a feeling you would prove everyone wrong. Sarah laughed softly. Including you? Jake thought about it for a moment. Then he grinned. I only underestimated how long it would take everyone else to catch up.